a dead man was lowered into the grave, and the deceased was revived. In Luke 9:28 and 30, Moses and Elijah came back to life at the time of the Transfiguration. In Matthew 9:18, 23 and to 25, Jairus' daughter rose from the dead. In Luke 7:11-15, the widow at Nain's son rose from the dead. In John 11:43-44, Lazarus rose from the dead. And all of these people, all of them, rose from the dead before Jesus did. So by the time he rose from the dead, this was actually a rather common occurrence. Rather than being hailed as a fantastic event, I would think it would have been met with a resounding yawn, followed by, so what else can you do? Moreover, people not only rose from the dead before Jesus, but after him as well. In Acts 9:36-41, Peter raised Tabitha from the dead. And in Acts 29-10, Paul raised Eutychus. Remember, he's the one that fell out of the window. So emerging from the dead is of no real consequence. Paul attributed immense importance to what is actually a rather bland event. A couple of the most common defenses one will hear in response to our criticism are stated by Frank Colquhoun on page 41 in his book entitled Hard Questions. He states, quote, accounts of people being raised from the dead are found elsewhere in the Bible, including 3 by Jesus himself. But in each case, they return to life in a way exactly similar to that of their former life and subsequently died. They were resuscitated rather than resurrected, unquote. These defenses are little more than acts of desperation. In the first place, if they were resuscitated, then they weren't dead to begin with. The fact is that they were dead, according to the text, just as Jesus was dead. If they were resuscitated, then so was he. If he was resurrected, then so were they. They were as dead as he was, and vice versa. There is no difference. Have apologists no decency, no intellectual integrity? And secondly, as far as these people dying again is concerned, that's irrelevant. Paul says it's a resurrection that matters, not the fact that they never died again. And how does he know they didn't die again? Scripture is silent in this regard. They could very well have gone to heaven like Elijah in his chariot. On page 120, in a book entitled The Case for Jesus the Messiah, the televangelist John Ankerberg makes a statement that is even more preposterous. He says, quote, if Jesus did in fact rise from the dead, then one must accept his claims about himself as being true. That is, the claim that he was in fact God incarnate. No one else of an estimated 100 billion persons who have ever lived in human history ever rose from the dead, unquote. Yet we just listed a sizable number of biblical figures who supposedly rose from the dead. They alone are sufficient to disprove Ankerberg's claim. His own book refutes him. On page 66 in the book entitled Answers to Tough Questions, McDowell and Stewart state, quote, Jesus, in coming back from the dead, established himself as having the credentials to be God, unquote. If that were true, then all those who rose prior to him established their credentials to be God as well. A second major problem with the resurrection becomes evident when we compare the accounts of what happened in the 4 Gospels. If we compare the four versions of what occurred after the women arrived at the tomb, sometime on a Saturday night or early Sunday morning, the problems become all too clear. First, at what time in the morning did the women visit the tomb? Mark 16:2 says, at the rising of the sun. John 21 says, when it was yet dark. Second, who came? John 21 says, Mary Magdalene. Matthew 28:1 says, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. Mark 16:1 says, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Salome. And Luke 24:10 says, Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other women. Third, was the tomb open or closed when they arrived? Luke 24:2 says it was opened. Matthew 28:1-2 says it was closed. Fourth, whom did they see at the tomb? Matthew 28:2 says the angel. Mark 16:5 says a young man. Luke 24:4 says two men. And John 20:11-12 says two angels. Fifth, were these men or angels, I don't know which, inside or outside the tomb? Matthew 28:2 says outside. Mark 16:5, Luke 24:3-4, and John 20:11-12 say inside. 6. Were they standing or sitting? Luke 24:4 says they were standing. Matthew 28:2, Mark 16:5, and John 20:12 say they were sitting.